fix this. We need to remedy this now because we've won Pennsylvania and we want every vote to be counted in a fair way.
That right there marked the beginning of former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi's support for Donald Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election, despite there being no evidence of fraud. While Rudy Giuliani was the face of the Trump campaign's effort to overturn the election results in Pennsylvania and was ultimately disbarred for his actions there, new reporting in the Washington Post sheds light on just how much Pam Bondi was a driving force behind the campaign's claims in a key swing state. The Post reporting that Bondi, quote, made unfounded allegations about evidence of cheating, fake ballots, and in private huddles with other campaign advisors, she discussed legal strategies to challenge the results in a state Joe Biden ultimately won by 80,000 votes. The Post adds, quote, Pennsylvania officials from both parties say there were consequences to her actions, arguing that Bondi spread misinformation that helped wreak long-lasting damage to the electoral system. One city official received anti-Semitic threats immediately after Bondi accused him of trying to intimidate Republican observers of the ballot count. It's that kind of loyalty that Bondi showed to Trump that made her his choice to be the top law enforcement officer in the country. Joining me on set, former top State Department official, MSNBC political analyst Rick Stengel. Mark and Michael are both back with us. Mark Elias, really no wonder that Pam Bondi was a natural choice for Trump to be AG. She was there for the first wave of the big lie.
Yeah, look, the one thing we know about Donald Trump is that he cares about election denialism more than anything else. It is the one irreducible minimum. If you look at every person who Donald Trump has appointed to almost every office, they are an election denier. It's the one, like I said, it's the gating entry. So it's Pam Bondi as the Attorney General. It is Kash Patel as the FBI Director. But it is also the person he has nominated for other cabinet positions that have nothing to do with justice. So he is going to insist that everyone at the RNC, everyone in his political orbit, everyone in the White House, everyone who is a political appointee is committed to the big lie about 2020, because that is what he cares most about. Look at how you began the hour with Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren. And who is he threatening with criminal prosecution? The people who told the truth about January 6th and about the election in 2020.
Michael Steele, I want to read you just a little bit more from the Washington Post about what Pam Bondi did on November 4th, 2020. So that's the day after the election. Quote, Bondi and Lewandowski drove together to Philadelphia. When they first urged Giuliani to come to Philadelphia, he was initially unsure that was the best place to wage Trump's battle to hang on to power. But Bondi and Lewandowski kept calling, and Eric Trump insisted. So she was involved, Michael Steele, in convincing Giuliani to join their efforts in Pennsylvania. What does that tell you?
Well, the idiocracy is alive and well. I mean, look, these folks have their own game plan, very much to Mark's point, which is about securing an opportunity to prosecute a case which only they believe. The facts do not bear out. 60 courts, federal courts, denied their allegations. Secretaries of states and recount after recount after recount in places like Arizona and Michigan and elsewhere showed that there was no fraud. They still need suckers to prosecute the case. Giuliani in that moment probably still had a scintilla of rationality left and said, well, I don't know if this is really a good idea. No, we're all on board because this is where Donald Trump wants us to go. This is what we're going to do. And that's the problem that the rest of us have to contend with in how we've been talking about this hour, is the fact that these people are now being offered up for positions of power and authority over our government to use our institutions of justice and the rule of law against those who only did their job as constitutionally ordered in with respect to January 21st, January 6th in 2021, and of course the election of 2020 itself. So, you know, I don't know how else we cut this. I mean, this is like a brown paper wrapping. It is so plain. It is so obvious what it is. And yet we still have people out here thinking that Pam Bondi is going to be the best kind of attorney general for us, and Kash Patel is going to be a great FBI director and so forth. No, they're not there for us. They're there for Donald Trump, period. And we need to understand that and know there are consequences that come from it.
Rick.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to make a couple of larger points. Weak leaders prize loyalty. Strong leaders want diversity. Strong leaders want different opinions. Weak leaders want the opinion echoed back to them. Pam Bondi should be, on paper, someone who would be eligible to be Attorney General. She's an Attorney General in another state. But she's an election denier. If there's a single thing that should be disqualifying from being the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, it's being an election denier. But as Mark said, that is the litmus test of loyalty that he depends on and needs. And the even larger point is, and I just hope the American people see this, he's appointing heads of cabinet departments who are against the entire premise of the cabinet department that they are heading. That's the Defense Department, the Justice Department, maybe even the State Department. I'm not sure the American people want that. So these are people who not only have not run large entities, they're people who disagree with the mission. And that's a dangerous thing in a republic, in a constitutional republic, that depends on these institutions.
There are people, you may have heard some of them, who said this was campaign rhetoric, or you can't always believe Trump, or wait and see. Well, tonight I can tell you the time for that kind of talk and waiting is over. House Republicans are using their government power to go after a conservative official who investigated the January 6th insurrection. Before I get to what they're doing, I want to begin with the facts. Imagine that. Fact number one. All members of Congress, regardless of party, have wide legal protection from prosecution for the work they do inside Congress, for what they say on the House floor or how they carry out their duties on a committee. It is a very high bar for the government in a different branch to prosecute a lawmaker for that kind of work, for those activities, unless you really find something like evidence, say, of bribery to sell government activity. We have seen members of both parties get in that kind of trouble. It relates to their government work, but it is a high bar. Fact number two, there is no such public evidence right now against any of the members of the January 6th committee. Fact number three, Congresswoman Liz Cheney spent her career as a Republican. Most people who follow politics are aware of that. She even rose to the GOP's leadership in the Trump era. She backed Donald Trump in 2020. But as you may have heard, he's been vowing revenge against her over her actual work in Congress. What I just told you about, that's usually protected material, protected activity. Liz Cheney today, I can tell you, is saying that January 6th revealed Donald Trump to be a cruel and vindictive man, and that his Republican allies in Congress are now fabricating lies and, quote, defamatory allegations in an attempt to cover up what Trump did. Now, that reference to defamation suggests one way that Cheney could potentially push back against attacks on her if she views them as defamatory and wants to go to civil courts to get justice for that. Now, to why we're talking about this right now. Tonight, Liz Cheney is responding to efforts to go after her in this period before Trump even takes office as House Republicans. Her former colleagues demand that she be criminally investigated by the FBI for her work, which they know all about. It's work they also do. It's work she did in Congress alongside them, whether they disagree on certain matters. The congressional work, a co-equal branch of government, of investigating the attack on their workplace, the Capitol, on January 6th, when Trump fans turned it into a crime scene. And in the hours after those now convicted attackers, some of them seditionists, were finally removed and ejected, remember, many top Republicans flatly condemned that violence.
We will not be kept out of this chamber by thugs, mobs, or threats.
Chaos, anarchy. The violence today was wrong and un-American.
All I can say is count me out. Enough is enough.
Those are just some of the Republicans who were condemning the attack that night. Again, they were condemning the thing that Donald Trump helped foment and that Liz Cheney and others later investigated inside of Congress. Remember, Trump's political vendetta is now being, as I mentioned, pursued by House Republicans. They are laying the groundwork. It is precisely the kind of, quote, lawfare that Republicans have claimed to be against. They use that word lawfare as a reference to what they view as politically targeted prosecutions. And that is quite clearly, notwithstanding the potential hypocrisy, what some of them are now arguing for against Liz Cheney because Donald Trump is mad at her. I don't mean to minimize the seriousness of this, but that's kind of what it boils down to, except he wants people to abuse power on his behalf next year. So Republicans, this is the update I mentioned at the top of the hour. I gave you the context and the facts for why it's hard to just go after lawmakers this way under law, but Republicans are calling for an FBI investigation. They've issued a new report, one member, Loudermilk, going as far as to claim the committee's work with witnesses was some kind of possible federal crime. The language is that federal laws were, quote, likely broken by Liz Cheney. That's the allegation. And this is a playbook that predates Trump. Republicans have long used Congress to try to push or launder or pressure separate parts of the government in the executive branch, in FBI and DOJ. Some of the efforts seem to get traction. Remember, what everyone thinks of James Comey, and he has critics across the spectrum, it was Republican pressure against him and demands that he brief them on things that they said needed even more investigation relating to Hillary Clinton's emails and other matters, and demanding those probes that led Comey to be writing letters back. Some of those, you may remember, were a big issue in 2016. But the history of that was Republicans pushing the FBI, just as they demanded investigations of even sometimes mid and low-level officials who worked for President Bill Clinton, if you go back that far. Other times, these efforts flounder. There were many claims made about possible or hypothetical Biden-Ukrainian corruption deals. Those boomeranged so much, were found to be so baseless, that the feds ended up indicting a source, of informant, for lying about those kind of apparently politicized claims that were designed to go after Biden, even if the evidence wasn't there. Now the playbook, as I'm reporting for you, it runs right alongside Trump. And he repeats the calls I just mentioned against Liz Cheney coming from the House with his own posts. He's here saying the FBI must investigate. This is new. That quote there is, he posted that online. Now, one thing legally, if our system and the guardrails and the courts hold, is that kind of demand could boomerang on Donald Trump. And I can tell you exactly how. If there is such a probe later, and judges view that as evidence of a demand for selective political prosecution, go after the opponents, well, that could end those whole cases. It could get things tossed. If Trump's incoming FBI pick, if confirmed, is seen as following what is essentially an order from the president-elect issued in public, online, in broad daylight, if that's the reason the probe was started or other potential misconduct occurs, judges tend to view that very negatively. Now, no one is above being investigated in a system of rule of law, but those investigations are always supposed to begin with evidence of a crime and never with a target of just some person that the president or the governor or whomever wants to go after. Trump's seeming confession on this point is that he wants the FBI to abuse power, and as I'm reminding you, this is a new one. He's saying this after the campaign, not something that's as easily dismissed as campaign rhetoric. If he wants the FBI to become his personal political police force, there are a lot of ways and a lot of parts of the government that last longer than the next 4 years that are designed to prevent exactly that. Now, you can't chalk up that new post I showed you to campaign rhetoric, which is something that I think some judges have entertained. To give you one example, in the litigation over the travel ban, which was previously sold on the campaign trail as a, quote, Muslim ban by Donald Trump, there were judges, and they're not MAGA judges or just looking to help him, but there were judges who said, we're not going to take campaign rhetoric about the travel ban and treat it as the same as what he said after the election when he's actually starting to govern. Well, here we are now after the election. As for the past attacks on, say, Liz Cheney and others, well, you've probably seen them. Those also definitely cross lines, legal or otherwise, is for judges to decide, but some of them were quite severe, with Trump saying about Cheney things like this.
Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. Everybody on that committee, for what they did, honestly, they should go to jail.
What they did on a bipartisan basis, remember, there was a lot of effort to make it a bipartisan investigative committee, was talk to witnesses. Many of the key witnesses worked for Donald Trump and were, like Cheney once was, pretty lifelong Republicans, people who agreed with many of Donald Trump's policies. That's what the committee did. And Liz Cheney had an impact, not just on the committee, but really in American life, precisely because her family has this Republican history, and she has this career as an arch conservative. And so for many people, that simply proved that her opposition to Donald Trump's January 6th coup attempt and later assorted efforts to hide it, that it was based on principle, precisely because it was Liz Cheney. It was not some political or ideological disagreement that morphed into something larger. She backed Donald Trump for office in the campaign. She was in Republican leadership. She clearly backed most of his conservative domestic policies. She only broke over the January 6th insurrection. The Biden White House could thwart much of this with pardons for the January 6th investigators and others. We just heard this week from a lawyer supporting that idea. Take a listen.
It's time, I think, to think about whether or not existing authorities need to be applied in new and different ways because Trump is a new and different threat. It's at least incumbent upon Biden morally and ethically to protect those who are at risk because they were on his side.
Your view of that proposal?
You know, look, I understand people's concern. I think it's a fair point to raise. The fact that the January 6th committee members themselves are telling us that they don't really want them or are concerned about these cases, I think that ought to be weighed very heavily in the balance here. I think the odds that any kind of investigation would get very far and charged by a grand jury and brought to trial and result in a jury conviction, particularly if the facts were as Loudermilk alleged them, I don't think any of those things would happen because the case would be in D.C. I don't even think the grand jury would return an indictment if the allegations that Loudermilk outlined were presented to them. I understand the concern, but, if you have Adam Kinzinger who's going around saying, and I think articulating well, that these are not things that they should be super concerned about. They're going to be resolved in the courts, and particularly in the jurisdictions where they would be brought, like D.C., those jurisdictions are very blue, and the judges at both the trial and appellate levels are very solid.
NBC's Ali Vitale is reporting from Capitol Hill. Joining us on set, former Republican Congressman of Florida, David Jolly, an MSNBC political analyst, and Michael Hardaway, former communications director and spokesman for Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, former staffer for Senator Dick Durbin. Okay, Ali, what kind of support are you hearing, or lack thereof, for RFK Jr. in his meetings with senators this week?
Well, Senator Dick Durbin is right to lay out the stakes that way, especially when you're talking about the skepticism and outright concern that we have heard from senators on both sides of the aisle when it comes to RFK Jr.'s prior statements and work around vaccines and delegitimizing vaccines that have worked to help people and save lives over the last decades. Specifically, when you talk about the polio vaccine and comments that RFK Jr.'s lawyer and ally has made about that vaccine, that's something that senators on the Republican side of the aisle, including Senator Kennedy, who you were just talking about with Julie, said that they had concerns about. We heard from Senator Mitch McConnell, himself a survivor of childhood polio, talking about the efficacy of that vaccine and the need to not delegitimize things that help people live and have made people's lives better. That's just one of the issues, though, when you talk about RFK Jr., that he's having to grapple with here in his meetings with senators. It's also his past statements about abortion. He has had various positions on this issue, but many of those positions worry Republican senators who fear that he might not be as anti-abortion and anti-choice as they would like him to be. And so that's certainly one of the things that is also in the swirl here in the Senate that senators are grappling with. Republicans have various members of this cabinet. It's not just RFK, it's also Tulsi Gabbard, it's Pete Hegseth, who are controversial in their own ways. And now that we're getting to a point where all of these nominees are up here on Capitol Hill, not just one or two, it's, I think, a reminder for many reporters, many senators, many staffers, that this is not just one confirmation battle that is going to be difficult, thorny, and controversial. It's several of them, and it means that January is going to be a month of fireworks up here on Capitol Hill.
Oh, no doubt about that. So, David, let's talk a little bit about RFK Jr., because you do have, obviously, vaccines. You have abortion. You have his comments about fossil fuels and the pollution they cause, and that as a health issue as well. Some things that make folks on the right a little nervous. Could they stop the confirmation, or ultimately do you think that Donald Trump will get his way?
I'm afraid Donald Trump will get his way. I mean, I think what we saw during the Hegseth meetings on the Hill last week, particularly if you isolate Joni Ernst and see the way she started to come around a little bit, the pressure from MAGA campaign, conservative media, all of this is starting to feel a lot like the Kavanaugh hearings, where there are people with protestations publicly early on, but then they all come into the fold. I think the greatest concern about, particularly in the healthcare space, with RFK Jr. and other health leaders that Donald Trump has picked, is the abandonment of public health. I mean, the role of government in those positions is to attend to the public health, not necessarily your private health, but COVID's a perfect example. How do we balance the needs of society to stay healthy versus the individual freedom mantra that Republicans like to wrap themselves in? And then the societal costs that come from abandoning public health as well. The posture of RFK Jr. with the rallying of Donald Trump and MAGA behind him could be a very dangerous chapter.
And, Michael, as Trump's DNI pick meets with lawmakers, sources tell Reuters at least 8 Republicans are uncomfortable, at least 8 uncomfortable with Tulsi Gabbard. We know she also met with one of the Democratic senators, John Fetterman. Take a listen.
Congresswoman, how was your meeting?
It was great. This has been a great opportunity to meet with both Democrat and Republican senators and address any questions or concerns that they have, and to talk about the role.
Did he seem open to supporting you?
I'm not going to speak for Senator Fetterman or any senator.
Are you feeling confident that you are going to?
I look forward to meeting with senators as we continue through this process.
Okay, pretty much every pick and every meeting, it's great, right? It's always great. But having said that, there are folks who are saying this is different with her because it's not about a specific position she takes. There's a lot of reporting out there that she's gone into these meetings unprepared, can't answer questions. Is that a different thing in terms of how they vote?
It's a different thing because she both seems unprepared, but also we need to know the answer to one very basic question. What happened in Syria? That was a very weird situation that none of us really knows what happens. I knew her at the time, and I recall when she came back, it was just weird. She was different. Her staff didn't know where she was, and so...
What do you mean she was different?
I can't explain it, but she was far more quiet and reserved when she came back and serious.
So what did you think at the time, knowing her?
None of us had any idea. I had a friend in her office, and the friend ended up quitting because she had no idea what was happening, and I think her staff also had concerns in terms of they didn't know what was going on. I have no idea. I'm just saying that the FBI and others should be able to figure that out for us.
Yeah, and still, but if you listen to people who have met with her, they still don't know the answer to that.
I do. I served with her, and I was being courted by the same people asking me to go to Syria at the time. The issue was Democrats and Republicans had agreed on a certain foreign policy posture towards Assad. The Syrian Christian community in the United States was making the case that Assad was at least protecting Syrian Christians. Recall all of the ethnic civil war going on in Syria at the time. We were seeing heads on stakes.
Yeah.
And so the Syrian Christian community was working with Congress, individual members of Congress, very hard to say, we're not telling you what the answer is, but please understand that Assad's protecting the Syrian Christians. And if we see regime change, which was something that was being discussed at the time, Syrian Christians could get slaughtered. The question, though, comes into Tulsi's judgment. Why did she then go? Many of us were offered the same opportunity and said no. She said yes. And I think what is at the root of the suspicion around Tulsi Gabbard is there's a lack of trust. Senators don't trust her judgment. They don't trust her answers. Can she overcome that? We'll see.
Do you know anything about what happened or what if there was a change in her might have happened when she was over there?
No, the issue was the meeting with Assad.
Yeah.
And that's where all members of Congress said, no, we're not doing that. She said, yes, we will do that. I think that speaks to her judgment, raises real questions in a confirmation hearing.
There's also a question of if one of these or more, I suppose you could say, but let's say one of these picks doesn't make it, who would they be replaced with? The Wall Street Journal reports, for example, that Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump Jr. led a campaign to prevent Mike Pompeo from becoming the next defense secretary. So it does raise the question, Michael, who would have Donald Trump's ear?
Yeah, and also let's not forget about the fact that the Trump operation isn't a traditional one. And so just because someone has a certain position doesn't mean they actually have the president's ear on that particular topic. For instance, Donald Jr. doesn't currently work for the transition, but he has a significant impact on decisions that are made there. And so that's another thing to consider when we figure out who's getting these roles in the cabinet, because the real question is who has the real influence there.
All right, we begin this hour with breaking news out of Capitol Hill, where just in the last couple of minutes, NBC News has learned the House Ethics Committee plans to release its report into now former Congressman Matt Gaetz. Joining us now, NBC's Ryan Nobles and Ali Vitale, both on Capitol Hill, and Brendan Buck, former press secretary to former House Speakers Boehner and Ryan. He is also an MSNBC political analyst. So let's start right, Ryan, with what we know about this committee plans to release this report.
Yeah, Jose, this is quite a bit of an about-face by the House Ethics Committee, which has wrestled with this question about whether or not it was appropriate for them to release this report into former Congressman Matt Gaetz, even though he was no longer a member of the body in which they have jurisdiction. And of course, comes after the committee, which had been working on this report for several years, was getting prepared to release this report at the end of the year. But then we're thrown a curveball when Gaetz was named as Donald Trump's pick to become the next attorney general. Gaetz then subsequently resigned from Congress, leaving the Ethics Committee in a bit of limbo. While there is some precedent for the Ethics Committee to release report of former members, that's generally not their policy, and it's something that they don't do very often. There was a push and pull between Republicans and Democrats on the panel. The House Speaker, Mike Johnson, got involved, said that he believed that it was not appropriate for them to release this report. But then as Gaetz began his process through the confirmation on the Senate side, Republican senators made it very clear that they wanted to see this report before making a decision as to whether or not they were going to vote yes or no on his confirmation. Gaetz then took the story in another turn by pulling himself out of the running for Attorney General and then making it clear he would not return to Congress even though he had won re-election, and the Ethics Committee was left with a decision to make. Initially, they had a meeting, decided they weren't prepared to release the report. That forced the hand of some Democrats in Congress who put a resolution on the floor for the whole House to vote on whether or not they should release the report. Republicans voted to refer that back to the Ethics Committee. And now we're learning today that when the Ethics Committee last met, they made the formal and final decision to release the report. Jose, we expect the report to be released sometime at the end of this week after they finish all the other business that needs to be done before they leave on their holiday break. We will finally see the results of this exhaustive report that the House Ethics Committee has on former Congressman Matt Gaetz.
Ali, any reaction or any word from the former congressman?
Certainly, Jose. We've seen Gaetz, and one of his central premises in the tweet that he sent out was that he doesn't have a chance to debate or rebut the things that are going to be in this report that we can now say will be released at some point in the near future. But part of what Gaetz says in a very lengthy statement posted to social media was that he has been investigated before. Certainly that's true, including by the Ethics Committee. This has been an on and off investigation into various ethical quandaries that the committee has ultimately not pursued. But he writes in part, this is from Gaetz, "I was charged with nothing, fully exonerated, not even a campaign finance violation, and the people investigating me hated me." He then goes on at a later point to talk about Quote, in my single days, I often sent funds to women I dated. I never had sexual contact with someone under 18, he writes. And he says any claim that I would be destroyed in court, which is why no such claim was ever made. He then goes on to make a point at the end that while it's embarrassing in his words, but not criminal, that he, in his words, probably partied, womanized, drank, and smoked more than I ever should earlier in life, I live a different life now. And then he ends with a point about never voting for continuing resolutions, which, of course, brings us nice back to a bookend of what Congress's actual business before the end of the year should be, which is keeping the lights on and funding the government. But certainly for Gaetz, a robust rebuttal online and the fact that this report now could come out. And I do think it's important for us to continue to underscore, Ryan laid out so well the landscape here on Capitol Hill and the back and forth push and pull over whether or not to release a report about a member who is no longer a member. He's right to point out that there's precedent for that. But I also think we have gotten rare views, sometimes to the chagrin of members on the Ethics Committee, who all take a vow not to leak, not to talk about what happens behind closed doors in their meetings. This is really one of the last committees that has that air of traditionalism to it. The idea that what happens in the room stays in the room. We don't often get insight into the decisions that ethics has made, what investigations they are pursuing, until they actually decide to release it and say so themselves. And so the fact that we have gotten these rare glimpses of transparency into how this process is working just goes to show, the volatility of Matt Gaetz as a former member of this body, but then also the scrutiny that is being put on these typically traditional bipartisan parts of Congress that are still left as rare vestiges here in this building, and the ways that those ends have kind of frayed during this process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fact, Ali, that is it not, that there have been no leaks or very little leaks about this or any other investigation from within that committee.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we're even watching Congresswoman Susan Wild, who is the Democratic ranking member of that committee, face allegations from other members that she somehow basically colored outside the lines of the rules of that committee to not talk about what has happened in the room. What they're pointing to when they say that is the idea that when the chairman of the committee, Michael Guest, came out and said, we were inconclusive in our vote. We didn't know either way whether we were going to release it or whether all of us were unanimous not going to release it. They were deadlocked, if you remember, a few weeks ago. Susan Wild made the point to come out and say, hey, I just want to make sure that everyone understands. Deadlock doesn't mean that everyone on the committee agreed not to release the report. So even just having that kind of a conversation about the outgrowth of the process can be seen by some members as members breaking the code of silence that this committee still very much has around it.
And so, Brennan, first of all, how unusual, and, I know we've been talking about it, and Ryan's certainly been mentioning that it's not something we commonly see, but how unusual really is it for a report to be released, especially after the member of Congress is no longer a member of Congress?
Yeah, quite rare. I guess there is some precedent to it. And one of the things I'm curious about is, will we get an explanation for the rationale at all? As Ali laid out, this is not a committee that holds open hearings, and you don't often hear why they're doing what they're doing. And we're sort of left to speculate what their motivations are. And I think there could be a few things. Yes, he has resigned, but he has also been elected to serve the next Congress, which starts in a few weeks. Now, he said he's not going to take that seat, but they may see that as a reason why this should be released, just maybe as a buffer for that. The other thing, and building off of what Ali said, it does operate in secrecy, but it is also considers itself fiercely independent. Most committees of the House are in some way an extension of the parties or an extension of the leadership. The House Ethics Committee feels that it is an independent body that should not have any political sway. And I do wonder, at one point when Mike Johnson went publicly and tried to sort of encourage or direct the Ethics Committee to not release this, if that was in some ways a mistake, if members of that committee feel like they are put in the position now of either having to look like they were carrying the water of the speaker rather than doing what they wanted to do. And I wonder if those members said, look, we can't allow that to be the impression of how the House Ethics Committee works, that Mike Johnson has told us not to release it, so we will now not release it. And then the other potential motivation for releasing this is maybe the most simple one. A lot of people really don't like Matt Gaetz. And he probably was not a very easy person for them to work with, and probably made a lot of enemies in that room throughout the process. And he has attacked that panel very publicly for the way that they've handled this. And I think they probably feel like they need to speak on their own behalf to put out their side of the story of what is really going on here. Now, this process is probably interesting, sort of inside baseball stuff. I think the most important thing is we're going to learn a lot more about Matt Gaetz, who still has, I think, a lot of ambition going forward. He's been rumored to be interested in running for governor down the line. And I think this could be a really, obviously, a watershed moment here for the public understanding of who this person really is.
And talking about that investigative committee, Brendan, what are the tools that committee has in its arsenal to investigate? In other words, to what level, to what degree can they investigate issues that in the Gaetz specific case go into some very personal moments?
Yeah, I mean, really anything that would call into the question the honor of the House is anything that is in the realm of what they can look into. And certainly personal let's keep in mind, there are some things here that were allegations made against him that would potentially be criminal. And he's talked about that. So certainly any criminal action, but also campaign finance violations. But they have a pretty broad mandate of things that could cast dishonor on the House to look into. And this is a very a panel that goes to great length and is very deliberate. They have a lot of investigators, a lot of serious professional staff who take this very seriously. To be under investigation by the House Ethics Committee is no small thing. This is not just, hey, come down and talk to a couple members of Congress and we'll ask you a few questions. They have serious lawyers and investigators who are going to go into this, and anybody who's been caught up in this can find it to be extremely disruptive to their being in the House. So I would expect this to be a relatively thorough report. They've been working on it for a very long time, and I imagine we'll get a lot of significant detail, and we'll have a lot more questions even to ask after we see it.
Meanwhile, it appears some Senate Republicans are still raising concerns about Tulsi Gabbard, Donald Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence. Gabbard met with lawmakers on Capitol Hill yesterday, but according to Reuters, sources say at least 8 Republicans are unsure about confirming her to the position. Reuters reports those lawmakers believe Gabbard was unprepared to answer tough questions during her initial round of meetings last week, including her 2017 visit to Syria with then-President Bashar al-Assad. The senators are also reportedly concerned about her lack of intelligence experience. If Gabbard loses the vote of these 8 senators, she'll need support from Democrats. The former Congresswoman met with Democratic Senator John Fetterman yesterday. So, I mean...
So Maura, it's sort of this amorphous kind of moving group of Republicans, which actually makes a lot of sense, because if you are if you're focused on intelligence issues your entire adult life, you're not going to turn it over to somebody who says sympathetic things about Russia and Assad. Same thing with if you're interested in America's national defense, probably not Pete Hegseth. I will say, I mean, Gabbard doesn't surprise me. I've always thought that she was like the most at risk of going down in a nomination fight. But I will say I was a little surprised yesterday at how open some very conservative Republicans were on RFK Jr. No, that's what I'm saying. We're moving all around. But I think it's very interesting, too, that, like, John Kennedy was that way because we Southerners understand that, like, the vaccine...
It's no joke.
...really helped the truly disadvantaged in the Deep South more than anybody else.
Well, there's a lot going on here. But I think that... First of all, I do think that these senators are trying to flex some power with Donald Trump because they don't want to spend the next 4 years just being a rubber stamp. And I think they're kind of trying to test their limits to see how far they can go without enduring his wrath. RFK is a decent target considering the fact that he was a former Democrat. Right. And so it's much easier for them, I think, to kind of raise some questions about this. But there are some of the conspiracy theories that RFK has trafficked in have real concerns even in red America. Right. For example, the drinking of raw milk. You know, some of the movement within this kind of RFK, conspiratorial, it's like a weird holistic movement. It's like not everything within that is bad.
The weird thing, though, like you talked about the raw milk and we're talking about vaccines, we conservatives used to make fun of hippies in San Francisco and Marin County going vaccines. No, this was just like a decade ago that we would mock and ridicule sort of these new age left-wingers for all the things that they've strangely become like mainstream for a lot of Trump supporters.
Yeah, the other thing about this is that if you are involved at all in kind of the social media universe of the trad wife movement or of this kind of holistic universe, you're seeing things that some of these Republican senators who are of an older generation may not be seeing. So there may be a disconnect between what they know to be realistic. For example, they're thinking, we support pasteurization.
Right.
It's not a particularly radical view.
Right.
But I do think that
we're doing pasteurization and fluoride in the water.
Right.
I mean,
and the polio vaccine.
Right.
Which I understand there's a quote that was unearthed from RFK Jr. saying more people died of the polio vaccine from polio itself, which would come as a big shock to tens of millions of Americans, that somebody actually believes that.
Yeah, it's a clip from a few years ago, but it's resurfaced this week with Kennedy making the rounds on Capitol Hill, suggesting the vaccine was deadlier than the disease itself, which, of course, it could not be less true. And we see Mitch McConnell is a living, breathing example of someone. Polio is in our lifetime, and then eradicated, thankfully, because of this disease. So, Molly, that seems like I was really, like Joe was, struck by Senator Kennedy yesterday, because we've talked for a while about, it's not always going to necessarily be the same four senators who say no. Yes, Murkowski, Collins, McConnell might be more reliable on most, maybe not all, but you're going to have to fill in the gaps with one or two somewhere else. Tulsi Gabbard held up, Joni Ernst held up as an example, maybe opposing Pete Hegseth. She still may. I know there's been warmer rhetoric. We should not suddenly suggest that she's a yes vote. But now the senator from Louisiana stands as maybe an unlikely person to oppose Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I think it's important to remember the Senate is not the House, right? They have a longer timetable, and while they're being threatened with primary challenges, it's not necessarily going to be, a lot of these people are not up in 2 years, though, of course, Collins and Tom Tillis are. Yes. But I do think, it's meaningful to think about Murkowski when she said that thing during the interview where she said you can't bully Joni Ernst into doing what you want. That is meaningful, right? She is not doing that because she's doing that because she's saying we are going to, I think anyway, that she's saying she's going to take Article 2, Section 2 seriously. Now, again, if you bet on Republicans being brave, you will lose a lot of money. But it does seem like there's certainly something here.
The thing is, people need to understand what sort of politician talk.
Right.
And so when somebody says, I'm going to allow the process to play out, what that means is they're looking at somebody sitting in the middle of a rotten wooden floor, and they're saying, I'm not going to push them through that floor. I'm going to just sit and I'm going to watch the process play out. That certainly is happening right now with Pete Hegseth. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nobody's saying, Joni Ernst did not say, she said, I'm going to see this through to the end. Creak. And so it's that way with some of these candidates. And we'll see. Maybe Pete Hegseth ends up passing it. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing from Republican senators.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting about RFK?
I have this exactly what he said.
Well, why did you say that?
Okay.
And then I'll go to...
The New York Times review of Mr. Kennedy's public comments over the past several years shows that he's consistently expressed views about the polio vaccine that are at odds with the medical consensus. For example, he has suggested that the vaccine was first introduced, it might have caused a wave of cancers, quote, that killed many, many many, 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 many more people than polio
That sounds like one of
ever
your texts.
did. It does. One of my texts.
Mika will repeat like the same word 12 times.
Thank you.
I don't have to do it that many times.
So he says that after the vaccine was first introduced, it might have caused a wave of cancers that killed many, 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 many more people than polio ever did. And he has said that the idea that the vaccine resulted in a drastic decline in polio cases is a mythology that is just not true.
Well, and that's when John Kennedy of Louisiana basically said, you better back off that. Now, what's so interesting, and I know since you study science and innovators so much, what's so fascinating about how this actually rubs up against what Donald Trump actually knows is one of his great legacies is Operation Warp Speed.
Sure.
Which he could not talk about over the last 7 or 8 years because his base did not want him to talk about it. But I suspect that at the end of that career, it's going to be like one of the first rooms in the presidential library because it really was, I mean, to do that in 1 year is something that few people expected. So that's why I do think he runs sort of head to head with Kennedy on the vaccine issue.
It's absolutely fascinating because indeed that Operation Warp Speed, getting a new type of vaccine was great. He was proud of it. And yet he's now made uncomfortable. You got 2 senators from Louisiana, by the way. You have, Senator Kennedy, you talked about, and I think he's using abortion as a cover, as a way to say, okay, I can vote against Bobby Kennedy, perhaps, because of the abortion issue. But you also have Bill Cassidy, a medical doctor, who, by the way, voted for conviction in the impeachment trial of Donald Trump. Now, he's up for re-election, and he may say, okay, this is the end of my term. But I know that Senator Cassidy, as a doctor, just is appalled by some of this stuff.